Footprints appear, then vanish. Holmes follows what others miss. Welcome to Fog Casebook. I am your host, Vela. Let me know where you're listening from below. Your comments mean a lot. Let's begin. It has been my habit in setting down those singular episodes in the life of my friend Mr. Sherlock Holmes to select such as exhibit, in the clearest manner, the peculiar bent of his extraordinary mind. There are cases in which his conclusions, though sound, depend upon considerations so technical that the lay reader may follow them only with fatigue. And there are others, again, in which the interest lies rather in human passion than in intellectual pursuit. Between these extremes stand a smaller number, mysteries in which the facts appear at first sight not merely perplexing, but positively contradictory, and in which the final explanation, when once given, possesses that inevitable simplicity which makes one wonder that it should ever have been obscure. Of such a nature was the affair which I have called the case of the footprints that led nowhere. It was in the early months of 1894, those raw, damp days when London seems built of soot and sighs, that I awoke one morning to find Holmes standing at the window of our sitting room in Baker Street, his long, spare figure etched against a pane which was already filming over with mist. He held his pipe unlit between his fingers and stared down into the street with that fixed, abstracted gaze which meant that, for the time being, I might as well have addressed a bust of Napoleon. "You are up early," said I, for the clocks had but lately chimed 8. He turned, and I saw that his eyes were alight with that quick, inward brightness which never failed to move me. Holmes in repose could appear the most languid of men, but let a problem present itself, let some knot of circumstance resist the first tug of common sense, and he became at once a being alert, vivid, and, if I may so phrase it, fiercely alive. "I have been up since 5, he answered. "There is nothing like the dawn for mental clarity. The mind, Watson, is like a blade. It must be honed upon fine mornings." "You have a case, then?" "Perhaps." He smiled faintly. "Or perhaps merely a message. In either instance it will, I think, interest you. Pray take your tea while it is hot. Mrs. Hudson has outdone herself." I confess that for all my affection for my friend, there were moments when his cold, superior manner tried my patience. Yet even then, and even while I buttered my toast and listened to the rain tapping with a persistent finger at the window, I could not but feel that little stir of anticipation which his tone awakened. There is a peculiar contagion in the expectation of adventure, and having tasted it at his side, I found the ordinary routine of my medical practice in Kensington a pale thing beside it. Holmes had scarcely resumed his station at the window when there came a brisk rap at the door below, followed almost immediately by Mrs. Hudson's shuffling ascent. "A gentleman to see you, Mr. Holmes," said she, opening the door to admit a tall figure whose presence filled the room with the damp chill of the street. The visitor was a man of perhaps 45, well dressed in a dark frock coat which bore the sheen of good cloth, though it had been splashed along the lower hem by the muddy gutters of the roadway. His face was narrow and clean-shaven, his eyes set close together, giving him, in spite of an otherwise respectable appearance, a look of strained alertness, as though he expected danger to spring from the very corners of the room. He carried in his hand a bowler hat that was wet and clenched, as if it were some weapon. He bowed stiffly. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" Holmes inclined his head. "At your service. This is my friend and colleague, Dr. Watson. Pray sit down, Mr." The man hesitated, then said, "Harcourt. Reginald Harcourt." Holmes's eyes flicked in that lightning fashion of his, over the man's boots, his cuffs, the slight stain on one sleeve, and the trembling fingers which now sought the safety of the chair. You have come from Clapham Common," said Holmes quietly, "and you have not slept." The visitor's face went a shade paler. "How? How can you know that?" Holmes waved a languid hand. "Your boots are still caked with the sandy grit peculiar to the paths along the common, particularly after rain. Your cuffs have the shiny crease of a man who has slept in his clothes. As for your lack of rest, your pupils are dilated and your hand shakes. More importantly, you have the air of a man who has been staring into darkness and seeing something in it that he would rather not remember." Mr. Harcourt swallowed. "Then you can help me?" "I can try," said Holmes, "but you will first have the kindness to tell me precisely what you desire and precisely what has occurred. Leave out nothing because you consider it trivial." It is often the very trifles that are most essential. I have observed more than once that Holmes's manner, which could appear almost insulting in ordinary circumstances, acted upon clients in moments of distress like a strong draught of brandy. It steadied them. It forced their thoughts into order. Mr. Harcourt drew a long breath and fixed his eyes upon the fire, as though it were easier to speak to the coals than to the cold, attentive intelligence opposite him. "I am not a man given to fanciful notions," said he at last. "I have served in my uncle's firm for 20 years. I deal in facts and figures. If I come to you, Mr. Holmes, it is because what has happened, what I saw with my own eyes, cannot be made to fit any fact I have known." Holmes settled deeper into his chair. His fingers, long and nervous, came together before him. "To proceed," Mr. Harcourt's voice dropped. "Last night, rather this morning, at 1:15, I was brought to my sister's house in Clapham by a footman from her household. There had been a disturbance. My sister, Mrs. Lydia Ashdown, was in hysterics. Her husband, my brother-in-law, was gone." "Gone?" I repeated before I could stop myself. Harcourt turned to me with that brief, sharp glance which begged me not to interrupt. "Yes, Doctor, gone. Mr. Julian Ashdown is not a man to wander. He is methodical. He locks his desk, he counts his cigars, he measures his words. He would not step into the street in his nightshirt and vanish like a character in a penny dreadful." Holmes's eyes remained fixed upon him. "And yet you believe that is what he did?" "It is what the house believes," said Harcourt bitterly. "It is what the police have written down, but it is not what happened. I will tell you the sequence as it was told to me, and as I saw the evidence of it." He shifted in his chair as if the memory made the very fabric uncomfortable. "My sister's house stands in a terrace near the common. At the back is a small garden enclosed by a brick wall. There is a conservatory, and beyond that a little gravel path that leads to the scullery door. Last night Mr. Ashdown retired at 10:30. My sister went up at 11. At midnight the servants were abed. There was no sound in the house save the ticking of the hall clock." Holmes nodded once, impatiently, and Harcourt hastened. At 1:00 the maid, Sarah, was roused by a sound which she described as a sharp cry, stifled as though a hand had been clapped over a mouth. She listened, keen, but heard nothing more. She did not rise at once, for servants have their fears, you understand, but after some minutes she crept into the passage. The house was dark. She could hear no further disturbance. But when she reached my sister's door, she found it ajar. Holmes leaned forward a fraction. She pushed it open. The room was empty. The bedclothes were thrown back. The candle on the bedside table was still burning, guttering low. And on the carpet, by the foot of the bed, there was a trail of wet marks. "Footprints?" said Holmes softly. "Yes, bare footprints," Harcourt answered, and his voice shook now despite his efforts. "Wet as if the feet had come out of water. They crossed the carpet, passed through the dressing room, down the stairs, and out through the back scullery door.
And then he clenched his hat tighter. Then they stopped. Holmes was very still. I knew that stillness. It was the poise of the hunter when the first twig snaps in the thicket. They stopped where? He asked. In the garden, said Harcourt. On the gravel path, a line of wet, bare footprints perfectly clear in the pale light of the moon, and then nothing. No sign of any further track upon the grass, none upon the flower beds, none upon the wall, none upon the road beyond. They led to the middle of that path, Mr. Holmes, and there they ended, as if the man had been snatched up into the air. For a moment there was silence in our sitting room, save for the faint hiss of the fire and the distant rumble of London's waking traffic. Holmes's expression had not altered, and yet I saw, in the slight tightening at the corners of his mouth,
that the case had taken hold of him. He had once remarked to me that the most delightful problems were those which, at first glance, appeared to defy reason, for in such cases reason, when applied, shone all the brighter. "And Scotland Yard?" he asked. Mr. Harcourt's eyes flashed with indignation. Inspector Lestrade himself came. He examined the garden, the wall, the road. He measured the footprints. He asked whether Mr. Ashdown had been drinking. He more than hinted, that my brother-in-law had gone out with some woman and contrived this foolishness to cover it. He suggested, too, that perhaps Mr. Ashdown had not gone out at all, that the story of footprints was exaggerated by frightened servants. Holmes raised an eyebrow. "And what do you think?" "I think," said Harcourt with suppressed fury, "that Lestrade is an honest man with the imagination of a boot. I saw the prints myself. They were there. And if my brother-in-law has fled, then where has he fled to barefoot and in his nightshirt? The air, the Thames, the very devil?" Holmes's fingers drummed once upon the arm of his chair. "When did you see the prints?" "At 1:45. They were still wet." "And the weather?" "Rain earlier in the evening. It had cleared by midnight. The gravel was damp." Holmes nodded, as though ticking off items upon an invisible list. "You said the footprints were wet as if from water, not merely from damp air." "Yes, the carpet marks were dark with moisture. The maid said they glistened." "And there were no other footprints? No boot marks? No signs of struggle?" "None," said Harcourt. "No broken twigs, no scuffs on the path, and nothing but those bare prints, neat as a child's in the sand, leading into the garden and vanishing." Holmes rose suddenly and began to pace, his hands clasped behind his back. The long lines of his figure moved to and fro in front of the mantelpiece, like the pendulum of some great clock. It was a habit of his when his brain was at work. "You have brought me," said he, "a problem in which there is either an illusion or an artifice. Nature does not make footprints that stop without cause. Therefore, if the prints stop, the cause is to be found, either in the manner of their making or in the manner of their disappearance." Mr. Harcourt leaned forward. "Then you will come? You will see for yourself?" "I will," said Holmes. "But first," he turned his keen gaze on our visitor, "tell me of Mr. Julian Ashdown, his habits, his enemies, his business. Oh, and do not omit to tell me why you, Mr. Harcourt, have come to me rather than leaving the matter entirely in the hands of the police." A faint flush rose in the man's cheeks. "Because Lestrade will call it an elopement or a drunken escapade and wash his hands of it. And because my sister—" His voice softened at the name. "Lydia is not strong. She is easily frightened. If there is something, anything behind this, I must know, and I think—" He glanced down, as if ashamed of the admission. I think there may be more than I have yet told you. Holmes stopped pacing. Indeed? Mr. Harcourt hesitated. There was a letter. A letter left by Mr. Ashdown? No, a letter received 2 days ago. My sister showed it to me because it troubled her. Holmes held out his hand. Oh, you have it with you? I do. Harcourt fumbled inside his coat and produced an envelope, slightly crumpled at the corners from repeated handling. It came by post. No return address, only my sister's name and the house. Holmes took it delicately as though it were a specimen from a laboratory. He did not open it at once, but examined the paper, the seal, the faint smudge at one edge. Interesting, said he. You have not even read it, I remarked. Holmes smiled without looking up. One can read a good deal without opening an envelope, Watson, but we will also read what is written within. He slid a thin knife beneath the flap and drew out a single sheet of paper. As his eyes ran over it, I saw the faintest flicker, so slight that another might have missed it, pass across his features. He handed it to me. It was written in a cramped, to slanting hand, the ink a dull black as though mixed with something more viscous than ordinary. The words were few, Mrs. Ashdown. The past does not stay buried. On the night of the new moon, the path will be taken. If you would not have your house shamed, keep silent. A friend I looked up. This is blackmail. Mr. Harcourt gave a short, humourless laugh. So I said. Lydia insisted it was some cruel jest. Julian grew very pale when he read it. He said it was nonsense. Then he burned it. But Lydia had kept this copy. She had traced it before he could destroy it. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Your brother-in-law burned the original? Yes. And he did not wish the police to know of it? No. Holmes returned to his chair and sat down with sudden finality. Then we have motive for secrecy, at least. Very good, Mr. Harcourt. Would you have done wisely to come? Do you think he has been murdered? Harcourt blurted. Holmes's gaze drifted toward the fogged window, as if he could see through brick walls and miles of wet streets to the little garden in Clapham. I think, said he, that he has been taken by some means which the police have not yet imagined. Whether he is alive or dead is a question which the next few hours may answer. But there is one point upon which I am already prepared to stake my reputation. And that is, I asked. Holmes's lips curved into that thin, sardonic smile. That those footprints did not lead nowhere, Watson. They led precisely where someone wished them to appear to lead, and precisely where someone wished them not to be followed. He rose, snatched up his coat and hat, and with that abruptness of action which always accompanied his resolution, turned to me. Come, Watson, we shall take the cab at once. Fog or no fog, the truth will not wait upon the weather. And so, within the space of a few minutes, we were rattling through the wet streets of London toward Clapham, while behind us Baker Street faded into the grey morning like a dream half-remembered, and ahead, somewhere in a small back garden, a line of footprints waited in silence to tell their impossible tale. The cab deposited us at the edge of Clapham Common just as the morning was struggling into being. A wan light filtered through the fog, thinning it to a pearly haze that clung to the iron railings and dampened the brick fronts of the terrace houses. Holmes stepped down first, his movements brisk despite the hour. I stood for a moment surveying the scene with an air of detached appraisal, as though London itself were a chessboard upon which some intricate endgame was being played. Mr. Harcourt paid the driver and led us along a narrow street where the lamps were still burning. The houses stood shoulder to shoulder in sober respectability, each with its little strip of front garden and its identical black door. At number 17 he halted. "This is it," he said. The house gave no sign of disturbance. The curtains were drawn, the windows dark. Only the scullery door at the side stood ajar, its edge swelling slightly where rain had soaked into the wood. Holmes paused before crossing the threshold, drawing a long breath as if to attune himself to the place. "One should always note the atmosphere of a scene," he murmured. It often betrays more than the eye." Inside, the air was close and heavy with that peculiar stillness which follows alarm. A house holding its breath. A maid waited in the passage, pale and red-eyed. She stared at Holmes with the reverence usually reserved for clergymen or surgeons. "My sister?" Harcourt asked. "In her room, sir," said the girl. "She has not slept." Holmes inclined his head but made no move toward the stairs. Instead, he knelt at once upon the flagged floor by the open door. "The footprints," he said quietly. "Show me." The maid led us through the scullery and out into the garden. It was small as Harcourt had described, a narrow rectangle of winter soil bordered by bare rose bushes, a short gravel path running down its centre to the low brick wall at the far end. The fog hung here like a veil, and the gravel glittered faintly with moisture. Holmes crouched, his face close to the ground. "Yes," he said, "they are here still." I knelt beside him and saw them plainly now, the unmistakable impressions of bare feet, toes splayed slightly, the heel marks deep and rounded. They ran in a straight line from the door across the gravel, stopping abruptly some 6 feet from the wall. I confess that a chill passed through me at the sight. The thing was so unnatural, so suggestive of sudden annihilation, that it stirred the primitive imagination despite one's reason. Holmes, however, betrayed no such weakness. He produced his lens and examined the final print with minute care. "Observe, Watson," he said, "the pressure. The pressure. The depth of the impression. Note how the final footprint is deeper than the one before it. Or the weight was shifting forward. The man was still in motion when the track ended. Then he did not pause. Precisely. Had he stopped, there would be a sign of adjustment, a twist, a deeper heel mark. There is none." Harcourt shuddered. "Then how—" Holmes rose and brushed the gravel from his knees. "Patience. We have not yet exhausted the ground." He paced slowly around the path, his eyes never leaving the earth. Then he moved to the border on the right, stooping to examine the dark soil beneath the rose bushes. "No disturbance," he said. "The ground here is soft enough to record even a cat's passage. Nothing." He crossed to the other side, then to the wall itself, running his fingers along the top. No marks, no scratches, no displaced mortar. I looked beyond the wall. The road lay empty, a ribbon of damp stone vanishing into fog. "And yet," said Holmes, "a man did not vanish into thin air. Therefore, Watson, we must consider not disappearance, but removal." "Removal?" I echoed. "Yes. Either the man was taken from this spot, or the evidence was placed here to suggest that he was." He turned suddenly to the maid. "Sarah, is it? You say the footprints were wet?" "Yes, sir, very wet." "As though the feet had been washed?" She hesitated. I suppose so, sir." Holmes nodded. "Thank you. That will do." He walked back toward the house without another word, and we followed him into the warmth of the scullery. There he paused again, scanning the room. "A curious thing," he said, pointing with his cane. "There is water on the floor, but only here, near the threshold. Beyond that it is dry." Harcourt frowned. The rain had ceased hours earlier, Holmes cut in gently. "And rain does not choose to fall only upon 1 square yard of stone. No, this water has been carried in." He ascended the stairs now, his pace unhurried but purposeful. On the landing outside the bedchamber, he stopped once more. "The carpet," he said. I bent to look. The marks were fainter here, but still visible, darkened ovals leading from the door across the floor. "Notice, Watson, how they are already drying," Holmes continued. "Compare them to the garden prints." I did so. The difference was plain. "The garden ones are fresher," I said slowly. "Exactly. Which tells us that the water upon the feet was renewed between the bedroom and the garden." Harcourt stared at him. "Renewed? But how?" Holmes smiled thinly. "That, Mr. Harcourt, is the right question." They entered the bedroom. It was a handsome room, furnished with sober taste. And the bed was disordered, the candle burnt low as described. Holmes sniffed the air. "Oil," he said. "Lamp oil." He crossed to the washstand, lifting the ewer. "Empty," he announced. "But see—" He tilted it slightly, and a single drop fell upon the porcelain basin, carrying with it a fainting, iridescent sheen. "Not water alone." "You mean—" "Yes, oil mixed with water, enough to give a shine, enough to deceive a hurried eye." Watson's admiration for Holmes's powers of deduction had been kindled many times before, yet here it flared anew. Each observation, trivial in itself, was being fitted into some larger, unseen framework. "And now," said Holmes, "we must ask ourselves who had the leisure, the motive, and the knowledge to arrange such a performance? Who knew the habits of this house? I who wished to suggest a disappearance rather than an assault." He turned to Harcourt. "You spoke of business. What sort of business did your brother-in-law conduct?" Harcourt hesitated. "Investments, shipping interests chiefly. He broke off, glancing toward the closed door, as if fearful of being overheard. He had lately withdrawn a considerable sum. He said it was for a private venture. "How considerable?" "Several £1,000s." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Ah." At that moment there came a hurried knock upon the bedroom door, and Inspector Lestrade entered, his expression a mixture of relief and annoyance. "So you're here, Holmes," he said. "I thought as much. Got a fancy theory already, have you?" Holmes regarded him calmly. "I have a working hypothesis." Lestrade snorted. "Well, mine is simpler."
The man walked out and gave us the slip. Happens often enough." Holmes's smile was thin as a razor. "Then I would suggest, Inspector, that you explain how a man refreshes the wetness of his feet halfway down the stairs, or why he carries oil and water with him in the night." Lestrade blinked. "What are you talking about?" Holmes leaned closer, his voice low and precise. "I am talking about a disappearance that has been staged, and footprints that were meant to end where curiosity would also end. And I am talking about a man who did not leave this house alive of his own free will." The inspector's face hardened. "You're saying murder?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that someone has gone to great pains to make you think otherwise." And as he spoke, I saw for the first time
A flicker of uncertainty pass over Lestrade's confident air, while in Holmes's eyes there burned that steady light which told me the game was truly afoot. Lestrade's incredulity hardened, as it so often did, when confronted by any suggestion which did not fit comfortably within his catalogue of commonplace crimes. Yet the inspector was no fool, and though his pride resisted Holmes's authority, his instincts were sound enough to recognize when a matter lay beyond his own reach. "You've got something more than words, I hope," said he, snapping his notebook open, "because I'll not have you unsettling the household with—" Holmes held up a hand with that quiet, contemptuous gesture which could silence a room more effectively than a shout. "Let us not waste time in posturing, Lestrade. You have men, I have eyes. Between us we may arrive at the truth, before it is made irretrievable. He turned from the inspector and moved to the dressing room, where he began a methodical examination that had, to my mind, the air of a surgeon exploring a wound. He opened drawers with swift, practiced fingers, glanced at the contents, replaced them exactly as he had found them. He lifted the bed curtains, ran his hand along the skirting board, and finally dropped to his knees by the hearth. "What are you looking for?" I asked. "For what has been disturbed," Holmes replied. "In a room where a man has risen in the night and passed through with wet feet, one expects to find not only prints, but the means by which those prints were made convincing." He rose with sudden decision and crossed to the washstand once more. "The ewer," he said, "empty, as we noted. Yet the basin is dry. If water were poured out for washing, there would be splashes, a film, a trail. There is none. Therefore the water was not used here as one uses water. It was poured deliberately into some other vessel." Lestrade, impatient, tapped his pencil upon the page. "And you'll tell me there's some mysterious vessel vanished into thin air as well?" Holmes's eyes flicked to him. "No, Inspector, not vanished. Removed. There is an important distinction." He stepped into the corridor. "Mrs. Ashdown," he called. There was a rustle, a stifled sob, and presently the bedroom door opened wider to admit a woman in a pale dressing gown. She was handsome, though her beauty was of that delicate, strained sort which seems always on the edge of collapse. Her hair was loosely pinned, and her eyes, large, dark, iron-reddened, fixed themselves upon Holmes with the desperate intensity of one who clutches at any promise of rescue. "Mr. Holmes," she whispered. Holmes's voice softened, not with sentiment, but with a certain practical kindness. "Mrs. Ashdown, I am here to help you, but you must answer my questions clearly, without concealment. Do you understand?" She nodded, pressing a hand to her throat as if to keep her voice from breaking. "Did your husband keep any kind of private correspondence?" Holmes asked. Her eyes flickered, and I saw at once that he had struck upon the sore spot. "No," she said too quickly. "None." Holmes did not challenge her at once. He merely inclined his head. "Very well. Did he have visitors in the evening? Any callers yesterday?" "No callers." "Servants come and go, tradesmen, messengers?" She hesitated.
There was a man from the docks. Julian spoke with him in the morning. I did not see his face." Harcourt, standing near the window, stiffened. "You never told me that, Lydia." Her cheeks flushed. It seemed unimportant. Holmes's gaze was steady. "It may be very important indeed. What was the man's business?" "I do not know. They spoke in the library. Julian shut the door." Holmes nodded once, then turned his attention to the room. "Now, Mrs. Ashdown, I must ask you something more particular. When you went to bed, did you notice any smell of oil?" She frowned faintly. "No, why would I?" "And your husband, did he complain of anything? A headache? Nausea?" She shook her head. "He was distracted. He said very little. He kissed me good night and turned out the lamp." Holmes's eyes narrowed at that. "You mean he extinguished the light himself?" "Yes." "And yet the candle was burning when the maid found the room." Mrs. Ashdown stared at him. I do not understand." "No," said Holmes softly. "No one in this house understands yet." He stepped close to the bedside table and lifted the candlestick, sniffing near the tallow. "Freshly lit," he murmured. "Not an hour old when discovered." Lestrade leaned in despite himself. "Are you saying someone came back in here after they'd gone to bed?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that someone wished to create the impression of haste and panic. A man roused suddenly would indeed seize a candle, but a man who is carried unconscious from his bed would not trouble to light one." Mrs. Ashdown swayed, and Harcourt moved quickly to steady her. "Carried?" she breathed. "Julian, oh God!" Holmes lifted a hand. "Not carried far, not yet. That is why we must be swift." He strode to the staircase, and I followed, my mind racing to keep pace with his. At the foot of the stairs he halted abruptly and pointed. "Here," he said. At first I saw nothing but the worn runner in the dark wood. Then as I bent closer, I perceived a faint smear on the banister, a thin glossy streak that caught the light. "Oil," said Holmes, "and here—" He indicated the second step from the bottom where the dust had been disturbed in a curious crescent. "A drag mark." Lestrade crouched, squinting. "Could be anything." "Could," Holmes agreed, "if it stood alone. But it does not stand alone. The oil, the renewed wetness, the drag, together they say one thing." "And what is that?" I asked.
Holmes's eyes lifted toward the ceiling as if he could see through it. That Mr. Julian Ashdown did not walk down these stairs, he was brought down them. A silence fell. Even Lestrade's pencil stopped. Holmes moved into the passage leading to the back of the house. In the scullery he knelt again, examining the damp stone floor with the intensity of a man reading a rare manuscript. "Watson," he said, "your eyes are good. Tell me, how many sets of footmarks do you see here?" I looked. There were the faint remains of the bare tracks leading outward. But among them, near the threshold, I detected something else. A partial imprint, narrower, with the hint of a heel and a pointed toe. "A boot," I said slowly. "Only one clear mark, but yes." Holmes smiled. "Excellent. And what do you observe about it?" "It is not wet." "Exactly."
A booted man stood here while the barefooted prints were made wet and new. He did not step in the water. He avoided it." Lestrade straightened. "So there was someone else in the house? That much we know. Burglar, perhaps?" Holmes's gaze sharpened. "A burglar who carries oil, lights candles, and takes the trouble to fabricate a trail of barefoot prints? No, this is not theft, Lestrade. It is theatre." He rose and pushed open the scullery door. Outside, the garden lay still beneath its blanket of fog. He walked directly to the point where the footprints ended and stood there, motionless, listening. "What are you doing now?" Lestrade demanded. Holmes did not answer at once. Then, very softly, he said, "Do you hear it?" I strained my ears. At first, there was nothing but the distant murmur of the waking city. Then beneath it,
a faint as a whisper, came a sound, an intermittent creak, like wood under strain. "A cart?" I said. Holmes nodded. "A cart or a hand-barrow, something with wheels, moved slowly, likely after midnight when the streets were quiet. The sound carries oddly in fog." He turned to Lestrade. "Post a man at the front and back. No one leaves this house without being seen." Lestrade bristled. "You can't order me about in my own case." Holmes's voice was mild, but there was steel beneath it. "The considerate advice. If you ignore it and the culprit slips away, you will have no one to blame but yourself." The inspector muttered something under his breath, but went out, barking instructions to the constable in the hall. Holmes remained by the final footprint, his eyes fixed upon the gravel. He bent, picked up something between thumb and forefinger, and held it up for me to see. It was a tiny fragment of dark fibre, almost invisible against his pale skin. "Wool," I said. "Wool," he agreed, "and not from any garment commonly worn to bed." He slipped it into his pocket. "Now, Watson, we are close enough to feel the warmth of it. The question is, where did they take him from this point? Over the wall? Through the conservatory? Or," His eyes flicked toward the conservatory glass which loomed at the side like a dark, silent mouth. "Not out of the garden at all." My heart quickened. "You think he may still be here?" Holmes's face was unreadable. "I think someone wished very much for us to stop looking once the footprints stopped. That alone is reason to look harder." He walked toward the conservatory, and as he did so, the fog thinned for an instant, to revealing the panes smeared faintly from the inside, as though a hand, oily and hurried, had pressed against the glass. Holmes paused before the conservatory, his tall figure reflected dimly in the glass. The structure was a modest one, iron ribs and cloudy panes, filled now with the faint, earthy scent of damp soil and dormant plants. He examined the smeared marks closely, angling his head so that the weak daylight caught their outline. "Palm impressions," he said. "Dragged outward, not inward." He opened the door and stepped inside. The hinges creaked softly and the sound seemed unnaturally loud in the hush of the morning. I followed at his shoulder while Harcourt lingered at the threshold as if reluctant to enter a place that might hold some dreadful confirmation. The interior was narrow, with a stone floor and a low wooden bench running along one side. Pots stood in uneven ranks, their soil dark and recently disturbed. Holmes moved among them with care, his eyes alert to the smallest irregularity. "Someone passed through here in haste," he observed. "See how the pots have been shifted, not overturned, but nudged aside. A man bearing a burden would do that. He would avoid noise." At the far end of the conservatory stood a door I had not previously noticed. It was half concealed by a trellis and led not outward, but back into the house, into what appeared to be a narrow passage running beneath the stairs. Harcourt drew closer now, his face drawn. "That passage leads to the cellar." Holmes's expression sharpened. "Ah!" He opened the door and peered into the gloom beyond. A faint, sour smell rose to meet us, the mingled odours of coal dust, damp stone, and old wood. Holmes struck a match and held it aloft. The passage descended by a few shallow steps and turned sharply. At the bend, the stone floor was stained darker than the rest. "Watson," said Holmes quietly, "if you please." I knelt and touched the stain with my fingers. It was tacky still. "Oil again," I said. "Yes, used liberally, enough to reduce friction, enough to slide a man who could not walk." Harcourt's breath came fast. "You mean they dragged him through here, into the cellar?" "Not dragged," Holmes corrected. "Lowered, carefully. Whoever planned this did not wish to leave marks of violence. They wished the man to appear absent, not assaulted." He moved down into the cellar, his match illuminating rows of shelves and a coal bin at the far end. The cellar was orderly, almost scrupulously so. Sacks were stacked neatly, bottles stood in symmetrical ranks. Holmes scanned it all in silence, then went straight to the wall opposite the stairs. "Here," he said. At first glance, the wall was unremarkable. Brick, whitewashed, unbroken. But as Holmes pressed his palm against it, there came a faint, hollow sound. "A false partition," I murmured. Holmes smiled thinly. "Precisely. And a recent one." He rapped sharply with his knuckles, then leaned close, examining the mortar lines. "Fresh work," he said. "No more than a fortnight old. Observe the colour, still pale, and the smell of lime is faintly perceptible." Lestrade's voice came from behind us, no longer derisive, but wary. "You're saying he's behind there?" "I am saying," Holmes replied, "that someone expected to have use of this space. Whether it was meant as a hiding place or merely a temporary station remains to be seen." He stepped back and surveyed the wall. "Inspector, I will need your men and tools." Lestrade hesitated only a moment before nodding. "Very well, but if this turns out to be—" "It will not," said Holmes calmly. A constable was dispatched, and within minutes the dull thud of a hammer echoed through the cellar. Brick by brick, the false wall gave way, revealing a narrow cavity beyond. The smell struck us first, a heavy, suffocating odour that spoke unmistakably of confinement. Harcourt made a strangled sound. "Julian!" Holmes raised a hand for silence as the last bricks were removed. Inside the cavity lay a small wooden platform, scarcely wider than a coffin. Upon it rested a man. He was bound at the wrists and ankles, his face pale and drawn, his eyes closed. A cloth was tied across his mouth, stained dark where breath and moisture had soaked it. His chest rose and fell faintly. "He's alive," I said, and felt a rush of relief so sharp it was almost painful. Holmes was already at his side, loosening the bonds with swift efficiency. "Barely," he said, and not for long had he been left. The gag was removed, and the man, Julian Ashdown, drew in a ragged breath. His eyelids fluttered open, unfocused at first, then sharpening with sudden terror. "Lydia," he croaked. "She is safe," Holmes said firmly. "And you will be, if you can answer a few questions. Who did this to you?" Ashdown swallowed, his gaze darting about the cellar. I cannot." Holmes leaned closer, his voice low but commanding. "You must. The men who placed you here did not intend for you to leave it. Our silence will not protect you now." Ashdown's face worked convulsively. "It was someone I trusted," he whispered. "Someone who knew everything." "Your business associate?" Holmes prompted. Ashdown closed his eyes. "My partner, Caleb Morrison." Harcourt stiffened. "Morrison? But he was abroad." "So he said," Ashdown murmured. "He returned secretly. Said he needed money. Said the past was catching up with us. I refused him." "And the letter?" Holmes asked. "Morrison's," Ashdown breathed. "He wrote it to frighten Lydia into silence." Holmes nodded once, absorbing it all. "Then tell me, why the footprints?" A faint, bitter smile crossed Ashdown's lips. "Because Morrison said the police would look no further than the garden. He said men believe what they see, especially when it makes a good story." Holmes straightened. Oh, and he was almost right. Lestrade cleared his throat. "We'll have him," he said grimly. "If he's still in London." Holmes's eyes flicked toward the cellar door. "He will be. Men who construct elaborate deceits rarely flee at once. They linger to enjoy their cleverness." He turned to me. "Watson, you see how each detail served a purpose. The oil, the water, the renewed footprints. Not a mystery of vanishing, but of misdirection." I nodded, my admiration once more renewed. As Ashdown was carefully lifted and carried upstairs, Holmes remained behind for a moment, his gaze lingering on the broken wall and the narrow space beyond it. "They nearly succeeded," he said quietly. "Another hour, perhaps 2. Oh, and the story of the man who walked barefoot into the night would have hardened into accepted fact." He turned at last and followed us up into the light, leaving behind the dark little chamber where footprints had led not nowhere, but exactly where someone had hoped no one would think to look. Upstairs, the house, so lately frozen in dread, seemed to exhale in one long, tremulous sigh. Mrs. Ashdown, who had been brought down to the parlour at Holmes's insistence, uttered a cry when she saw her husband borne in upon a makeshift stretcher, and would have flung herself upon him had I not caught her gently by the arm and guided her to a chair. "Easy, madam," said I. "He is alive, and that is more than we dared hope an hour ago." Her fingers clutched at my sleeve with a desperate strength. "Julian!"
Julian, can you hear me?" Ashdown's eyes opened again, and for an instant the hard, guarded mask of the businessman fell away to reveal only a man's raw relief. His lips moved soundlessly. Then, with effort, he formed her name. Holmes stood aside, allowing the human scene its moment, but his face remained intent, his mind already beyond it. I knew well that for him, the recovery of Ashdown was not the end, but the removal of one curtain. The actors who had staged the disappearance were still at liberty, and the very fact that they had been thwarted made them doubly dangerous. Lestrade returned from the hall, his boots striking the boards with brisk authority. "I've sent a man for a doctor," he said, then glanced at me and added, "No offence meant, Watson, someone local in case you're otherwise engaged." Holmes's mouth twitched. "It is considerate of you to remember Dr. Watson has 2 lives, Inspector, one for his patients and one for your disasters." Lestrade ignored the jibe. "This Morrison, Caleb Morrison, you know him, Harcourt?" Harcourt's face had the rigid pallor of a man whose world has shifted beneath his feet. "I know of him," he said. "He is Julian's partner, yes. In a shipping venture, I believe. I have met him twice. He is smooth, plausible, the sort who shakes your hand while counting your silver." Holmes stepped forward. "Tell me everything you know of him, his address, his habits, his associates." "I do not know his address," Harcourt admitted. "He has offices in the city, Leadenhall Street, I think, but he was meant to be in Antwerp. Julian received word of it." Holmes's eyes gleamed. "Received word? From whom?" Harcourt hesitated.
"From Morrison's clerk, a man named Denton." Holmes's head tilted slightly as if listening to some internal music. "And this clerk is employed by Morrison, yet conveniently provides an alibi for him. Interesting." Mrs. Ashdown lifted her head at that, her cheeks wet with tears. "Julian," she said, forcing steadiness into her voice, tell them what he said to you about the money." Ashdown swallowed. He looked even now as if the effort of speech cost him something. Morrison said, "He needed it tonight. Said there was a creditor, a man who would ruin us. He said if I did not pay, he would expose what we did in '89. Holmes's gaze sharpened. "What you did?" Ashdown's eyes flickered toward his wife, and for the first time I saw in them not merely fear, but shame. "It was a mistake," he murmured, "a foolish venture."
Morrison and I signed for a cargo we did not possess, a paper cargo. We thought we could cover it before anyone noticed. But a man died, Dr. Watson, a dockman, crushed when they tried to shift empty crates. The inquiry was hushed. We paid. We buried it." Mrs. Ashdown made a soft sound of distress. "Julian—" Holmes's voice was very quiet. "And Morrison has held this over you since." Ashdown nodded faintly. He said, "There was someone who had never been paid enough to forget. Someone who had kept records. Yeah, he said the new moon was his deadline." Holmes's fingers tapped once upon his own wrist, as though he were measuring the hours. "The new moon," he murmured. "Last night." Lestrade scowled. "So Morrison tries to blackmail him, stages a fancy disappearance, hides him in the cellar. Why not just kill him and be done?" Holmes's eyes met his.
Because Inspector, murder is final. Blackmail is profitable. Morrison did not wish Ashdown dead. He wished him pliable. And when Ashdown refused, Morrison chose a method that preserved the victim while removing him from his wife, his home, and his legal protection. "And the footprints?" Lestrade persisted. "A distraction," Holmes replied. "And a flourish. Men like Morrison enjoy cleverness. They believe a neat deception is its own reward." At that moment the bell rang sharply from below. One of Lestrade's constables opened the door, and a messenger was admitted, a thin lad with a cap in his hand and rein on his shoulders. He glanced nervously from face to face until Lestrade barked. "Well?" "It's for Mr. Holmes," said the boy, and held out a folded note. Holmes took it. I opened it with that same delicate care he had shown Harcourt's letter, and read. I watched his expression with the closest attention, for I had learned that the slightest change in those keen features could signal more than any exclamation. For an instant his eyes narrowed, then he folded the note neatly and slid it into his pocket. "A message?" I asked. "A courtesy," Holmes answered. "And a warning," Lestrade's suspicion flared. "Who sent it?" Holmes looked at him. "The man you wish to arrest. Caleb Morrison has just informed me that he regrets our little interruption in the cellar." Mrs. Ashdown gave a startled cry. "He knows you are here?" Holmes nodded. "He knows more than that. He knows that I have found Mr. Ashdown. He knows that your story of footprints will not stand, which means—" his voice hardened, "that he will act quickly now. For his plan has failed." Lestrade's jaw set. "We'll get him. Where is he?" Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he crossed to the window and looked out into the fog. The street beyond was still quiet, the morning only half awake. A milk cart rattled past, its driver hunched against the damp. "He is not foolish enough to remain in his office," Holmes said, "nor will he return to any address known to the police, but he has one pressing need." "And what is that?" I asked. Holmes turned, and in his eyes there was that cold, bright light I had come to associate with the instant when his reasoning clicked into certainty. "To remove the evidence of his involvement. He has left traces, physical ones, here, oil, wool fibres, fresh mortar, and he has left another trace which is more dangerous still." Lestrade frowned. "What trace?" Holmes's gaze shifted to Ashdown. "A living witness." A shiver ran through the room. Mrs. Ashdown's arms tightened around her husband's shoulders as if she could shield him by force of will. "Then we must take him away," Lestrade snapped. "We must," Holmes agreed, "and at once. But we must also consider that Morrison, having failed to silence Ashdown permanently, may now choose the method you suggested earlier." Lestrade's face darkened. "Murder." Holmes inclined his head. "And he will not do it himself. He will employ someone who knows the docks and the backways of London, someone who can move unseen in fog." Harcourt's eyes widened. "The man from the docks, the one Lydia mentioned." "Precisely," said Holmes. "You see, Mr. Harcourt, you have been more useful than you realize." He turned briskly to Lestrade. "Inspector, you will take 2 men and escort Mr. and Mrs. Ashdown to a place of safety. Scotland Yard, if you must, though I suspect Morrison has ears even there. At the very least, keep them under guard." Lestrade bristled. "And what will you do?" Holmes's smile was thin. "I will go to the one place Morrison cannot avoid if he wishes to preserve his secrets, the docks." I felt my pulse quicken. The case, far from ending with the discovery in the cellar, was tightening like a noose. Morrison was now aware that Holmes was upon his trail, and a cornered man, especially one accustomed to manipulating others, is often at his most dangerous. Holmes picked up his hat. "Come, Watson." As I reached for my coat, I caught sight of Mrs. Ashdown's face, still wet with tears, but now set with a fierce, pleading hope. Holmes met her gaze for a fleeting instant. "Aye, madame," he said, "your husband lives. It is my intention that he remains so." Then, without another word, we went out into the fog-bound morning, leaving behind us the trembling household and the man who had nearly become a legend of impossible footprints, while ahead, somewhere among the cranes and tarred ropes of the river, the true hand behind the deception was already moving to strike again. The fog lay thicker by the river, rolling in heavy folds between the warehouses and wharves, like some living thing that wished to conceal what passed beneath it. The smells of tar, wet rope, and brine hung in the air, mingled with the distant clang of iron and the low voices of men beginning their day's labour. Holmes moved through it all with unerring purpose, his long strides never hesitating, out as though the confusion of the docks were a map already familiar to him. "You seem very certain of our destination," I remarked, struggling to keep pace over the slick stones. "Quite," said Holmes. "Morrison has two concerns at present, speed and silence. He must ensure that Ashdown never speaks, and he must do so without drawing attention to himself. Therefore he will not act directly, he will delegate." "To the dockman you mentioned?" "Yes. And such a man, summoned in haste, will not go to an unfamiliar place. He will come where he already feels secure." Holmes turned sharply down a narrow lane that ran between two warehouses, their brick walls looming on either side like cliffs. At the end stood a low building with a sagging roof and a single lamp burning above the door. "A tally house," Holmes said, "where accounts are settled and men paid. Morrison knows it. The dockmen know it. And if a message was sent at dawn, this is where the recipient would come for his instructions and his coin." We waited across the way, half concealed by stacked crates. The minutes stretched, broken only by the creak of rigging and the slap of water against stone. Then a figure emerged from the fog, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy coat, his cap pulled low. He paused beneath the lamp, glanced about him, and knocked twice. Holmes's hand closed on my sleeve. "Observe," he murmured. "He looks neither right nor left until after he knocks. That is the habit of a man who expects to be admitted." The door opened briefly, then shut again behind him. "And Morrison?" I asked. "He will not show himself," Holmes replied. "Not yet. He is cautious, but he is also vain. He will wish to see the thing concluded." We did not have long to wait. Barely 10 minutes passed before a second figure appeared, a slighter man, well dressed despite the hour, moving with the easy confidence of one who believes himself unseen. Even in the dim light I recognized the type: smooth hair, careful step, the manner of a man who has never lifted more than a pen. "Morrison," Holmes said softly. He crossed the street and disappeared into the tally house. Holmes straightened. "Now, Watson, what do you intend?" "To give Mr. Morrison exactly what he expects, and nothing more." He strode across the street and knocked. I followed, my heart pounding, keenly aware that we were stepping into the lair of a desperate man. The door opened a fraction, then wider, as Holmes thrust it inward and entered without ceremony. Inside, the room was small and poorly lit. A rough table stood at its centre. The dockman leaned against the wall, his arms folded. Morrison stood opposite him, a purse in his hand. Morrison started when he saw us, his eyes widening for a single instant before his composure snapped back into place. "Mr. Holmes," he said smoothly, "what an unexpected pleasure." Holmes smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "On the contrary, Mr. Morrison, this meeting was inevitable." The dockman shifted uneasily. "What's this?" Holmes did not look at him. His gaze remained fixed upon Morrison. "You have been paying this man to do your dirtiest work, first to assist in removing Mr. Ashdown from his bed, and now, I imagine, to finish what you began." Morrison laughed lightly. "Absurd! I have merely been settling accounts." "Indeed," said Holmes. "Why, then you will not object to Inspector Lestrade settling one more." The dockman swore and made for the door, but Holmes moved with astonishing speed, planting his cane squarely across the man's shins. He went down with a cry. At the same moment, the door burst open behind us and Lestrade's voice rang out sharp with triumph. "Stand fast, in the name of the law!" Morrison's colour drained. He took a step back, then another, until his shoulders struck the wall. "You sent for me," Holmes said quietly. "By means of that note. You wished me to know that you were aware of my presence. That was your mistake." Morrison sneered, desperation creeping into his expression. "You had no proof." Holmes's eyes glittered. "On the contrary, I had motive, opportunity, and a pattern, the oil you used to ease the passage of a helpless man, or the false wall built in anticipation, the footprints refreshed to deceive, and finally," he gestured to the dockman, "the accomplice you believed too ignorant to betray you." Lestrade snapped the handcuffs onto Morrison's wrists. "Caleb Morrison, you are under arrest for conspiracy to abduct, attempted murder, and—" "You forget blackmail," Holmes added. "And blackmail," Lestrade finished grimly. Morrison sagged, the fight gone out of him. "You think you're clever," he muttered to Holmes, "but you nearly missed it. The footprints were meant to lead nowhere," Holmes finished for him. "Yes, but nowhere is often the most interesting place of all." Later that evening, when the fog had lifted and the lamps were glowing along Baker Street, I sat with Holmes by the fire as he filled his pipe. And the case had been concluded with gratifying swiftness. Ashdown was safe, Morrison in custody, and the dockman already turning King's evidence with remarkable enthusiasm. Lestrade had departed in high spirits, vowing once again that he would never underestimate Holmes. Holmes, for his part, accepted the inspector's gratitude with indifference, his thoughts already drifting elsewhere. "It was the footprints, wasn't it?" I said at last. "That was the heart of it." "They were the bait," Holmes replied. "A clever one. Most men would stop there, content with an impossible mystery. But impossibility is merely a signpost, Watson. It points to where one ought to look more closely. And Ashdown's secrecy? Human weakness, Holmes said, which criminals rely upon as much as they do upon darkness or fog. Had he spoken sooner,
none of this would have occurred. I regarded him thoughtfully. "You saved a man's life today." Holmes shrugged. "I prevented a lie from becoming the truth. The life was incidental." He rose and stood by the window, gazing down at the street where the gaslight gleamed on wet pavement. For a moment his reflection stared back at him, lean, sharp, and solitary. "There will be others," he said quietly. "Other deceptions. Other trails meant to end in nothing. Remember this one, Watson. When facts appear to vanish, it is usually because someone has taken great pains to hide them." He turned away, already reaching for a monograph he had left unfinished, the case apparently dismissed from his mind as thoroughly as if it had never troubled him. Yet as I later set down these events,
I could not help but reflect upon how near London had come to acquiring another ghostly legend, a man who walked barefoot into the night and disappeared. That the truth proved both simpler and darker than the tale is due entirely to the singular genius of Sherlock Holmes, for whom even footprints that led nowhere were but another path toward the light.